Good evening. You've joined the Kingston Forward Work in Progress presentation. This is a re-recording we've made for Zoom and for posting on the web. Kingston Forward is what the City of Kingston calls its exciting initiative to replace the citywide zoning code. That old document dates from 1961, a very different time in Kingston and America, and it's time to replace that tool with something that better matches the community values of Kingston today and for the 21st century. First, this meeting is being recorded. This is also being held live in person in the Common Council chambers in City Hall. And we're making this recording for those who couldn't join live. We're going to post it at engagekingston.com and at various places on the web so everybody can get caught up. During the meeting, people will be submitting questions via the meeting chat using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we'll keep a record of all those comments and questions and suggestions that come through. Our presentation consists of several parts. First, a welcome from the mayor. Then I will give a brief overview of what we did this week, along with my colleague Amy Groves, who's a principal in our firm, Dover Colin Partners, and the project director for this work. We'll take a look at some of the big ideas that have emerged from the many conversations this week, and then we'll zoom in on some particular places in Uptown, Midtown, in the Rondout, in Pankaki, and Wilbur, and talk about how things might be if you change the code and encourage more of the kind of development and redevelopment that you want, and less of the kind that you don't. And at the end, we pass out a survey so that everyone has a chance to give us their feedback and let us know what they feel most strongly about and what questions they have for next steps. First, by way of introductions, my name is Victor Dover. I'm a town planner and urban designer leading the team from Dover Colin Partners. Our firm has really the privilege of traveling all over the country, helping communities decide what they want to be when they grow up. And we're joined by an amazing team of people who are based either nationally or locally and here in New York State to help us with all sorts of issues like the environmental impact statement, the legal implications, the transportation planning and traffic engineering, and the conversion of the old paper book code to a modern online interactive version. I want to say that we're very fortunate to be here at this time in your history, because it does seem to us that the more conversations we had, the more keenly aware we became that Kingston actually, for hundreds of years, has had one of the strongest, most potent town building cultures anywhere. When we look at the amazing work that was done, not just in the 1600s, but in particular between the 1860s and mid-1920s, to build the Kingston that you wanted, the Kingston that we now think of as the subject of historic preservation efforts. You were in Kingston as good at building towns as any community we could find anywhere in the world. And it's time to get in touch with that again. You know, it is not uncommon in American cities that in the latter half of the 20th century, we got out of touch with the way of making traditional neighborhoods or traditional walkable tree-lined streets. And we're not surprised at all to hear people say they want to get back in touch with that tradition. You know, it's actually a little bit like pressing the reset button on your whole town building culture, because it's not just replacing the zoning code, though that's a terribly important part of it. It's also fixing your transportation plans, your investment plans for capital improvements, and rethinking your approach to historic preservation and economic development and many other topics, including affordable housing. Now, to reassure you, we are at the very beginning of a long process here in replacing the zoning code, and so there's a lot of time left for people to give us their feedback about where they think we're on the right track or things we might want to be sure to include. We began this work just this fall with some initial site investigations and passing out initial surveys and so on. We'll share some of the results of that with you. And now you see that big star toward the left of your screen. That's the charrette event. That's the event we've held here in Kingston over the last week, and we're wrapping up in tonight's work in progress presentation. But look off to the right. There's a long process ahead. You know, the business of taking everything we think we've heard you say this week and synthesizing it down into a first draft of the code, and then plenty of time for revisions, the environmental impact statement, and so on. But by late summer or early fall, we expect that this new form-based code will land on the desks of your Common Council for their consideration as adopting into the law of the land. So I want to make sure that we get all that done right. Now, for those who haven't heard the rundown on it, just a quick reminder of what form-based codes are, and just a little comparison. Every land development regulation deals with several key things, like managing nuisances or preventing incompatible uses from being near one another, or setting out rules about how far apart or how close together buildings can be. In conventional zoning, which is the sort of code that you have right now, really designed for the suburbs in the great suburban expansion of the mid-20th century, the organizing principle of the document is the land use. So you have residential, and then a section to look up the rules for residential development. You have a section for commercial, and another section for industrial, and so on. And the assumption was these things are not allowed to mix, and therefore, nor change, and therefore we could just have one standalone piece of the code to deal with that. Form-based codes are much more tied into the reality of traditional urban neighborhoods, of the kind human beings have been building for 3,500 years or so, where use and density are still regulated, in fact, closely, and we still think about controlling nuisances like noise or noxious fumes. But the fundamental organizing principle of the code is the physical form. What's the relationship of building to street? What kind of street is that? What height and position on its lot will the building take? Those are form ideas, and that's the basis for a form-based code. And we'll talk more about that in the future, but fundamentally, the tools in conventional codes leave you without the predictability you need to know what kind of city you're going to get, whereas form-based codes are more predictable. And uncertainty is the enemy of reinvestment. So we like form-based codes because you don't have to just be a rich investor from out of town with fancy consultants and engineering firms and so on, or land use lawyers, to figure your way through the maze toward a permit for something to build. With a form-based code, it's simpler, it's clearer, it's graphically illustrated, and ordinary people can understand the code and get a sense of what they are allowed to do on their property. So just a quick look at what we did so far on this project. Before we even came to town and started working on the charrette itself, we had initial meetings, and Amy Groves will talk about that process.
Good evening. So now we're going to walk through the process so far that's led up to today. And we started this project back in September, and before the charrette week, we started with analysis and really understanding what the built conditions are in Kingston. So we came out for a site visit in September and had some initial walking tours. We've also been holding meetings with city council members. We came to different boards and commissions like the Conservation Advisory Council, the Kingston Land Trust, Live Well Kingston, and we've been having meetings and conversations with different stakeholders to talk about street design, what has been going on up to today with urban agriculture and preservation and other topics. And the goal for these meetings was really for us to begin to understand the opportunities and concerns around rezoning in the city. And while we were there, we also spent a lot of time taking measurements and photographs of the different neighborhoods in the city, and something we call a synoptic survey, where we measure the width of travel lanes, the width of the sidewalk, the distance from the sidewalk to the front of the building, and really kind of understanding the pattern of buildings and streets and what's existing throughout the city today. So all of that work led up to this week, and I have the schedule here of charrette events. And the goal was really to have a number of different ways that people could be involved, from large group meetings to small one-on-one conversations at a time that worked for them. We know people are busy and want to give lots of opportunities for people to get engaged and get up to date with what we're working on and tell us what they think. So I'm going to walk through each of these events now. And so we started last Thursday with a virtual kickoff session. And so this was held on Zoom. We started with an introductory presentation where we described the overall process and the goals for this. And then we broke everyone who came into groups. We had about 60 people come to the meeting, and we broke into different rooms and had conversations and marked up on Google Maps the ideas. And so there's a summary of some of the ideas here. Things included affordable housing, revitalizing Broadway, allowing for more small businesses, looking for opportunities in the Midtown warehouse area. Here's some additional ideas. Things with street design, walkability came up in many of the conversations. Urban agriculture, tree coverage, green spaces. So again, it's a really good way for us to talk with people and understand what the priorities are and what the concerns are, and so that we could, just start off our Charrette Week with instruction from the community. So then the next night we had a similar meeting, but in person. So we, in City Hall, we rolled out base maps and again, gathered in groups and did some brainstorming and marked the maps with markers, talking about what future development could look like, where there's opportunities, areas in the city, and where things are just really great. And we want to see preservation into the future. And so at the end of the night, we had one person from each table get up and summarize their table's 3 big ideas. I have just a few snippets of some of that feedback here on the screen. For example, safe streets for all, reducing speed, and improving intersections, affordable housing came up at many tables, mixed uses, improving pedestrian connectivity, and stitching the Rondout area back together. So here's a synthesis map. I know this is rough. We'll make a cleaner version of this following the charrette, but we tried to take all the many ideas from the tables, both Thursday night and Friday night, and put them all on one map. So you can see on the left a list of kind of policy ideas that apply throughout the city. So the wanting to have more affordable housing, encouraging safe streets, wanting to increase historic preservation efforts, have a little more clarity around what the standards should be. And then some place-specific things. You can see the legend down on the lower right of the screen here. There's ideas for specific streets or intersection, like the 5 Points intersection on Greenkill Avenue, where there was a desire to kind of look in a little more detail. Then there was ideas for open space preservation marked off in green. The purple hatch, that's preservation, that's not necessarily historic preservation, but neighborhood preservation. So there is an idea here that these areas were just really special neighborhoods, and there was a desire to keep the neighborhoods, the community, and make sure that as improvements and rezoning takes place, that there's a real emphasis on opportunities for people to stay in the neighborhood and keep the existing, make sure that those opportunities remain into the future. There's also opportunity sites you can see in the pink hatch. So for example, along Broadway or in the warehouse area north of Broadway, were just a few of the sites that some tables identified to us that we should be looking at for that could potentially be different in the future, and that new zoning could help to guide what that change could be. So following those events, we had a series of walking tours, and this was an opportunity to get out on site with the community and really understand the existing conditions in the neighborhoods together with you all. So we started on Saturday in Midtown. We were at the Center for Creative Education, and we had a really great tour actually of that facility that's in the new Energy Square building, and kind of understanding the resource that's there for the community. And then following that tour, we went out and walked through the neighborhood. We stopped at sites like this empty site on Broadway and talked about the desire to have more affordable housing, and maybe that's something that could be part of future development on this site. We also walked back through the residential areas of the neighborhood and took special note of the sidewalks, the street trees, and looked at all of the area, the pattern of buildings, how buildings relate to the streets, and how comfortable it feels to walk or bike on streets in the neighborhood, and wanting to make sure that in the future the zoning reinforces the existing character, but also, street design standards could help to improve walking and biking conditions. So next we went to Uptown, and we focused on the historic core of Uptown, and really had a great tour, understanding how that area has evolved through the number of years. And it has, existing residential buildings and mixed use buildings, and, from the earliest stone buildings to, and they've all fit together nicely on the street. And you can see it's because they have a similar grammar where the front doors of buildings are aligned to face sidewalks and really create this really great walkable environment in Uptown. And even in the Main Street commercial areas, just a really great walkable character. We ended the tour talking about how these historic precedents could relate to the scale and form of potentially new buildings that are around the outer edges of the historic core. The next day, on Sunday, we started in Wilbur, and we had a really great tour. We looked at the community gardens and walked the streets. And one of I think the key takeaways from that tour was the connectivity in the area, and I should say the lack of walkability. So, the folks who live there, expressed to us that they would, really, they find it difficult to walk even just to their neighbor's home because of the lack of sidewalks. And even where there are sidewalks, they need improvements and to make it comfortable and easy to walk amongst the settlement. It's a really a pretty amazing place, right next to the natural cliffs and along the Rondout Creek, and this little settlement of homes and businesses. And I think there wasn't a desire for us to be looking at the code, how we could strengthen connectivity and walkability of this place. Next, we went to Pankaki, and again, walked through the streets of the neighborhood. And from that tour, my takeaway was the real desire to make sure that there's opportunity for the families that have lived there for a long time to continue living there, and that new development can be small and incremental and on the scale of what exists there today. And so we looked at the existing buildings, and this area, I should note, the city is doing a study potentially to become another historic district, which could again just kind of reinforce that future development happens at the scale and character of the existing buildings. We paused, you can see in this picture, at the area along the waterfront and talked about how there's some larger areas in the waterfront that could have potential for change. And there was pretty diverse opinions about what that should be. There was some discussions about housing and the need for affordable housing, and that could be in that area, but also concerns about sea level rise and resiliency. And so wanting to make sure that whatever happens there, is in keeping with the city's environmental goals. And again, walking through the streets of the neighborhood, you can see here that, there's a real character established by the existing buildings that can help to inform what, any future infill on vacant lots or, preservation efforts should be in this area. Lastly, we went to Rondout, and again, we started the tour on Broadway, but then quickly went off through the rest of the neighborhood. We looked together at sites that had been recently proposed for new development and talked about what those proposals had been. And we also looked at the great historic buildings. We looked at the open spaces and how the homes and buildings frame the parks and open spaces, and just really looked at the character of the streets. There's really great character that has been established over the years in that neighborhood, and so talked about how the existing zoning could reinforce that character. So following the walking tours, we set up at our studio space at City Hall, and on Monday and Tuesday we had a series of stakeholder discussions, and we had folks joining us in person as well as over Zoom. So it was a good opportunity for people to drop in and talk with us. You can see a list of topics here on the right. We had an an hour. Sometimes we went an hour and a half for each topic, housing, transportation, environment, economic development, preservation, arts and culture. So it was really interesting for me, being in each discussion, to hear, some of the unique ideas based on, for example, a specific topic of preservation, but then also to, keep hearing several themes that came through. For example, I think each meeting talked about affordable housing and the impacts, not just for a housing specific meeting, but for example, economic development, the need to have housing so that workers can afford to live here, or arts and culture, that artists, there's housing that is affordable for artists. So, that's, I think, interesting to me to hear the kind of overlapping themes from those discussions. We also had a series of open studio hours. So, during the day we were at City Hall, and then each evening we went out to a different neighborhood. So Sunday night we went to Rondout, Monday night to Midtown, and Tuesday night Uptown. And so we had hours that, we had our exhibits and maps around the room, and just talked with community members who stopped in, and just to give another opportunity for people to see what we've been hearing so far, and to talk to us about what was important to them. We had a series of exhibits that have been traveling with us to these different events throughout the week. For example, these boards that people could write on. This one asks, what character, form, and appearance should new buildings in Kingston have? So here's just a couple of the examples. Wanting new buildings to be affordable and accessible and sustainable. I liked this quote. It says, whatever is compatible with existing structures at the same time enables expanded uses and more affordable housing, so people are not priced out of our community. And someone else came along and wrote yes. So it's interesting to see people building upon the ideas that others had written. We also had some exhibits with dots where people could identify, buildings that they would like to see more of, or this example, we asked people which goals that could be advanced through the zoning code was most important to them. And you can see the larger green dots were where we got more responses. And so, these are all important, but it is interesting to kind of see the areas where, historic preservation, walkability, affordable housing, diversity of the community, green building, all, very important to folks who came out and met with us this week. So all during the week, our team, as we were hearing all these ideas and, a lot of words for what the vision for the future was, they've been creating sketches so that we could have some, initial concepts to review with you all tonight. So this was a way of, again, just being a little more vivid with the ideas and seeing if we're on the right track, or, what things people like and what they don't like. And then we're going to use these illustrations to help us with writing the code and what the setbacks and heights and the parameters for future development and future preservation should be in the city. So all of that, will be summarized in a little more detail. We're going to be putting together a shred executive summary where we have, all the feedback we've heard, the results of the initial survey that has been on the Engage Kingston website, from early October through this week. And so all of those results will be available probably in a couple weeks. We'll have our executive summary ready and we'll put it up online, and you can see a longer summary of all these events. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Victor to talk about how all of this feedback has been shaping some ideas around the new code.
After hundreds of hours of talking with people and walking and looking and taking pictures and having technical meetings and going over old documents and new ones, some key themes are emerging. There's a lot of material for us to absorb, and so we've got a lot more of that absorbing to do. But we thought it would be useful to just look at a short list of some of the key themes that are emerging. This in some ways is a to-do list for us on what we have to work on as we get the code done, and in a way is also an incomplete list that you can add to your responses to the surveys. So these are some of the big ideas and themes that have emerged. Now remember, this is a a draft. We've started this list. We may have missed something. You'll probably tell us tonight if we did. The first thing on the list is that it ought to be easy to do the right thing. And that means if someone is developing in keeping with the traditional scale and character, the building to street relationships we talked about, the architecture and so on, and they're doing so at a small scale, so their impacts are relatively contained and easily absorbed by the community, then that sort of development ought to be easy to get a permit for. So if we could make more of those things permitted by right or as of right, that means also making the code easy to understand and creating a kind of quicker path for people who are developing in keeping with the community's vision. Now, that also means we need a more conventional path with lots of steps and perhaps some risk of being told no at the end for people who are proposing something at a much bigger or much more impactful scale. Second is this idea I've been calling the building to street relationship. How far is the building from the street? Do blank walls face the street or parking lots face the street? Or do storefronts or doors and windows or balconies and porches face the street? And of course, which of these is appropriate for a given site depends on where it is. So context is very important, as you'll hear more about during the street design discussion to follow. Third, every meeting we had turned into a meeting about housing. Even meetings about arts and culture or about technical matters or transportation. In every single conversation, Kingstonians have been reminding us that there needs to be more housing and that we need to have some specific approaches toward encouraging more affordable housing to get a mix of incomes in the healthy city. And that means having more types and sizes of dwellings to own or rent. It also means getting back to the conversation about accessory dwelling units. There was a recent conversation that was paused to give us a chance to get this process started. But accessory dwelling units are a time-honored way of providing some naturally occurring affordable housing. So we need to get in there and tweak the rules so that the right kinds of ADUs in the right places are permitted. The environment was a big theme, not just in terms of being more thoughtful about when trees are lost, including street trees, but the bigger picture of environment, how to lower the vehicle miles traveled and thus the tailpipe emissions or wasted energy or wasted space for parking by making it more feasible to make short trips and more feasible to make walking, biking, and transit trips. That, of course, means that mixed-use development is one of the green strategies for reducing the city's carbon footprint and adapting to climate change. We also heard about environmental subjects like encouraging local access to fresh and healthy food through urban agriculture, encouraging pollinators instead of just sod, and in adapting to sea level rise. Subject of street design was a big one, and of course the key to a lot of this is to make the city more walkable and bikeable. We also heard about street details like the street trees I mentioned a minute ago, and of course bluestone. Yes, for the folks who are wondering if we heard you that the bluestone is a very big issue. On parking, we heard a lot of opinions, various kinds. Some folks said that they wanted to make sure there was a parking space waiting for them when they got somewhere and were looking for it. But mostly what we heard was that the current zoning's parking requirements are a burden on small business and on housing that is increasing costs and limiting feasibility for infill of development of exactly the kind people said that they wanted. So some advocates even suggested that we eliminate minimum parking requirements altogether, or at least do that in certain locations. So we're going to have to look at that very closely. And then last, there are trouble spots in the existing zoning, places where non-conforming widths or lot frontages or lot sizes or other criteria render a parcel infeasible for development. There are also some places where we can clean up and clarify and strengthen the historic preservation rules. And then last, just make it much simpler to understand what the standards are that apply to each person's lot. So with these big ideas in mind, we're going to go zoom in now on some specific site areas around town in various neighborhoods and look at some examples of what we found as we began to test these ideas on real life sites. And we'll start that with RT Harshaker and Andre Jackson.
Hello, I'm Andre Jackson with Dover Coleman Partners. RT and I took a glance at Kingston's Midtown District and its future concerning small incremental development. Midtown has a rich urban fabric and an interconnected network of streets. RT and I focus on Cornell Street, which runs north-south, interconnecting with Kingston's Broadway, connecting Uptown to downtown. As you can see, many of the parking lots north of Broadway are extremely underutilized. Also, building frontages are set back from the right-of-way, causing low user experience at the human scale.
So one of the things that we looked at as we were analyzing this site was really what was in the current ordinance and how we could unlock kind of value for these large lots. And so within the current ordinance, there are actually no block face requirements, right? So making sure that we can get future connectivity within this site and really have more frontages available for additional development. Oh, if we could go back, Amy, one slide. There's also kind of unclear building and parking placement standards. So it's hard to know from a predictability standpoint where buildings would be located. There's a lack of kind of maximum lot width and lot depth requirements to actually get the incremental development that people love within the community. And then there's a lack of frontage types and rules. So what Victor was kind of talking about and how the buildings meet the street, there should be requirements to actually talk about that. Okay, next slide.
You can notice how much space the 3 adjacent parking lots on Cornell Street are taking up compared to the buildings that they're actually serving. A lot of the parking lots had a 40% or less utilization rate throughout the year. So this made it an ideal site for RT and I to look at and try to develop and conceptualize some ideas on how we could infill the lots with missing middle housing and affordable housing. So as stated before, with small incremental development, we can create middle affordable housing and storefronts that engage the street while also condensing the amount of parking to key areas.
So in addition to what Andre was saying, we definitely tested different block face sizes based on the context around the site. And we use streets to actually divide these large sites into walkable blocks, right? So like I mentioned, really pulling the value from Broadway into these other blocks and parcels. And then, thinking about how the code can actually provide predictability, not just for the development industry, but also for the community, right? So that what exactly is going to come up around you. And so, in order to do that, the placement of buildings and parking becomes really important, right? So build 2 lines help with that. And then we talked about this a little bit, but, using frontages, not just to, obviously we want to welcome people into the private realm from the public realm, right? So from the street into your home, but that the homes and the buildings, also the way that they meet the street, they provide a gift to the street, right? So that the public has a communal benefit from the buildings that are shaping the public realm.
So the smaller incremental development strategy will support a variety of different housing types, including apartments, live-work, townhomes, mews, duplexes, and some single-family housing, while incorporating green space and pocket parks throughout the blocks.
So when thinking about, this particular community and the building types and also the functions, we definitely heard a lot from the artist and community that there needed to be more spaces for flexible use as well as living spaces. And so really thinking about that and thinking about the lot width and depth, So basically using the minimum and maximum dimension standards to get a variety of lot types, which in turn leads to a variety of building types, right? And if we think about preferences, some people like it small and some people like it large, right? And so, basically a variety of lot sizes leads to a variety of building types, which equals sustainability. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about the evolution and the transformation of this place.
So as RT stated before, we heard a lot of feedback from the community, which is comprised of a lot of talented artists and designers. And the idea for makerspaces received positive feedback from our open studio. So we decided to conceptualize how these makerspaces could re-engage Cornell Street. And this re-engagement would unlock the true value of the large lots for live workspaces and revitalize Midtown's existing interconnected street network at the human scale.
As Andre mentioned, we studied this site and looked at it from a plan view and, looked at the connectivity and also the lot sizes and building types. But we can't just study things in plan. It's really important for us to also understand volumetrically what happens. And so this diagram is really intending to do that, to understand the scale, right? How much is too much? And so we'd be really interested in knowing what you all think of, what we showed before and then this as well. Trying to understand, like what bulk and height is appropriate, and then also looking at like some of the warehouse buildings that we've heard that are very loved within the community that are valuable to the fabric, but then using things like building types, right, and like live work or work live type of units to actually transition to the single family homes rather than setback and step back standards.
So we also received a lot of feedback concerning accessory dwelling units throughout Midtown. And with Midtown's deep lot depths, our firm-based code will provide a template for incremental evolution concerning accessory dwelling units.
I think Andre mentioned this, but we definitely did hear about ADUs as a potential option to provide affordable housing. And I think in the prior example, that was definitely a transformation of an area, right? And seeing how that would work in a small and incremental way. And this one is really thinking about it from an evolutionary standpoint. So how would this area kind of change in a very slow manner? Adding the ADUs to the rear of the site, knowing the typical lot sizes that you have. And then also, thinking about junior ADU addition to the side of the home, right? So you could actually have 3 units on a lot instead of just 1. And with that, we will pass it to Eric.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Pate. I'm a town planner and urban designer with Dover Cole & Partners. I had the opportunity this week to take a closer look at punk hockey and to see what kind of lessons we can learn from the neighborhood that maybe could be applied to other neighborhoods in Kingston. I wanted to take a closer look specifically at the existing zoning code and what that looks like on the ground with some on-the-ground examples. So as we can see here, the majority of the neighborhood is within the R2 and R1 zoning districts. R1 for single unit, single family residential, and R2 for 2-unit residential. And as we can see here, this is the table of the lot and bulk requirements for these zoning districts, for the R1 and R2 zoning districts. And you can see here, there's a number of specific requirements for each of the districts. Now, I want to go through and if you go to the next slide, we'll see an overview of the neighborhood with lots that don't meet those requirements or some of those requirements that were on the previous slide. we see here almost, a significant portion of half of the neighborhood is non-conforming to existing land use regulations. So that it's quite evident that there's a disconnect somewhere. We think we know where. I mean, it's within the 1961 zoning code that was applied to this neighborhood that already had an extensive pattern of development, of historic development, that did not quite fit in with the new vision brought in with the 1960s. So if we go on to the next slide here, this is an overview of the neighborhood. And I kind of want to go on a remote virtual walking tour of the neighborhood and highlight specific examples of areas where properties within the neighborhood maybe don't match up with the existing zoning requirements. So here on Gill Street, we see a pretty typical street scene with a number of houses that are built up to the street, that are facing the street, and built at if not the property line, just a few feet past the property line. So that's interesting when we see that the R1 district actually has a 15-foot minimum front setback. So we can see here is a very obvious example of a disconnect between the existing zoning code and what's actually on the ground. The next example that we see is a 3.5-story building, a 3-story building with an attic, here on a street corner, just a block away from that last example. And the existing zoning code has a maximum height limit of 2.5 stories. And so while most of the neighborhood is within that 2.5-story limit, there are a number of examples where existing buildings are actually higher than that. So moving on to the next stop on our virtual walking tour, we see a property here that's oriented towards East Union Street, but maybe it wasn't necessarily intended to be oriented towards West Union Street when it was originally plotted. But nevertheless, it's subject to not only a 15-foot front yard setback, but a 30-foot rear setback. What that does is it essentially kind of makes this property unbuildable, right? There's the buildable area of this lot is not very much at all, if it's existent at all. And this is an interesting example because this is actually a property that's owned by the Kingston Land Bank. So we have an example of where the existing code might be a challenge for affordable housing initiatives in the neighborhood. Going on to the next example, here's a property that has a number of dwelling units, and the current maximum dwelling unit allowance for the R2 district is 2 dwelling units per lot. So there's an example of a property here that has more dwelling units than what is essentially allowed on paper within the R2 district. And there's a number of examples of these, both in the R2 and the R1 district. The next example is of a small house on a very small lot. And this is a perfectly acceptable house in this neighborhood, a historic house in this neighborhood, and it doesn't match the minimum lot size requirement of 5,000 square feet that's currently on the books for the R2 district. And so this is another example of where the historic development patterns, they don't match what is essentially the city's vision for future development in this neighborhood via the 1961 zoning code. So we want to fix this mismatch. Moving on to a specific study sample that we've identified here at the intersection of East Union Street and Gill Street. There's one lot in particular I want to highlight here. It's here on Gill Street, the light blue rectangle you see on the right side of your screen. We know from looking at the Sanborn maps, the fire insurance rating maps from the 1930s, that there is actually a house located here. So you see that the lots in blue there, the blue rectangle. And so that shows where you saw in the previous image where there's a parking lot right now, that historically there was a house there. Right now, this lot is actually a non-conforming lot. It's less than 5,000 square feet. So, let's imagine a scenario in which the current property owner, maybe would want to at some point revert back to its historic use as a residential use, as a house. Right now, the current code would prevent them from doing that without them going through a special permit process. So we want to look at ways we can kind of allow these small scale, neighborhood scale infill opportunities that better match the historic pattern of development in these neighborhoods. So here's an example of that new house located here, along with potential for a few accessory dwelling units that are added. And along with streetscape improvements and another potential change recommendation for updating would be to the urban agriculture standards that the city currently has, where essentially urban agriculture, community gardens, they're prohibited currently on lots or properties less than 5 acres. And so, what that does is it precludes the use or it precludes the use of community gardens in smaller areas, more smaller scale neighborhood areas. So here on the southern block here, block corner, there's a few vacant lots that maybe the property owner would be amenable to supporting or allowing a community garden to be placed. So with changes to the urban ag requirements, that could be a possibility. In addition to maybe another ADU here and there, we start to see how this corner becomes more of a community center. It already is, but this is just kind of removing whatever barriers there are to making it fulfill its potential of being even more so an identifiable center of the neighborhood. And on the left side of your screen, you'll see that property that we looked at just a few slides ago that's owned by the Kingston Land Bank that is currently a single family house, but with a few code updates, maybe that property could provide for more affordable housing in the future. So this is just an example of how a few code tweaks and code updates could really allow the neighborhood to build out the way it was intended to when it was originally laid out and plotted. So that's this sample for Ponkaki. Moving on to the next neighborhood that we were able to take a closer look at, Wilbur. We see here it's a very small area, but it's a culturally significant and very historically significant settlement, one of the original villages that joined Kingston later on. You see the long road coming down through the hills there at the top of your screen as you enter Wilbur from Kingston. This is Wilbur Avenue, and that's main way in and out for a lot of people. In the next slide, we'll see a synthesis map of ideas that were shared with us on our walking tour of the neighborhood. We see that intersection here highlighted. And the reason that we want to look at this is while we were there hearing from residents and community members, was that this intersection is feels unsafe. It is unsafe because of the high speed that people traveling down Wilbur Avenue, coming down the hill. It's really easy to pick up speed there. And so we want to look at ways, how can we make this a more accessible and a safer intersection for residents of Wilbur, and to not let it keep its status as a barrier, essentially, to pedestrian movement through the neighborhood. We've identified where there are existing sidewalks, areas where the sidewalks are in need of significant improvement, along with areas where there are no sidewalks currently. In addition to the bicycle and pedestrian connection that has been sought after for quite a while to connect to Rondout. And that's an important quality of life goal that the community has. So this is all surrounded by ecologically sensitive natural communities, very steep bluffs that the community highlighted as areas where this should be protected. There should be more kind of land use tools to allow for the promotion of more clustered development that doesn't spread out and take up as much land, and a variety of methods to do that. So those have been highlighted to put on our conservation lens whenever we look at those areas. So moving on to the next slide here, we can see the current zoning for Wilbur. We see that most of Wilbur is under the R1 district. And so the R1 district is for a single dwelling unit per lot. And we see here that's subject to the same 15-foot front yard setback that we saw in Ponkaki. But what was also interesting is one of probably the most striking building coming into Wilbur, the Flatiron building, right at the intersection that we highlighted earlier on Wilbur Avenue as you're coming into the neighborhood. That's about a 3-story brick building that is actually within the RRR district. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see the RRR district actually has a front yard setback of 30 feet. So there's, it just like that doesn't work. It's obvious that doesn't work for that particular parcel. That's just, one example of, something that we want to take a close look at to make sure that we're not, or that we are being very precise when we review these areas. Moving on to the next slide, this is what that essentially looks like when you have these smaller lots that are being subjected, or that are essentially working under the existing zoning districts and land use regulations. You see that there are a number of lots that are considered too small. They're less than the 5,000 square feet minimum lot size. And so again, it's an example of where on the ground conditions do not work well and communicate with the rules that are currently on the books now for the area. And moving on to the next slide here. The next neighborhood we're going to look at is Rondout, and wanted to thank you all for your time. Thank you.
Now let's take a look at the Rondout area, where, as you all know, urban renewal extracted a painful toll. You can see 9W, the new bridge, coming across, and the whole area of the city that was reconfigured starting in the 1960s with urban renewal. And in the middle of your screen, coming down along the diagonal parallel to 9W, that's Broadway. And so we heard about this area from a great many people, and it seemed like a logical place to test out some of the building to street relationships we've been talking about and the code ideas, because we heard from so many people wondering when can this be made more complete? How can this area be brought back in to the fabric of the city? There's a trauma associated with urban renewal. It's not uncommon, happened in a lot of cities, and it takes a long time to resolve it. One of the first things that we did was we overlaid the historic map of the fire insurance map of this area. I spoke earlier this week about how when we look at maps, we're like doctors looking at x-rays. And these little pink and yellow boxes are brick and wood frame buildings that existed in the area prior to urban renewal. We just overlaid them here at the same scale. And in a map of a city like this, you see the buildings start to coming closer together, being more frequent, being more attached to each other. That's the place where the urban fabric thickens up and a center is formed. And you can see with buildings on both sides of Broadway, right in the center of your screen, that this was once a neighborhood which had a lot more of that street-oriented mixed-use development than we have today, just on remnants on one side of of Broadway or along Strand. So we took a look at this area, from a high aerial angle. Now we're looking kind of southeast. And 9W is at the top of your screen. You can see the bridge going off on the upper right. And in the middle of your screen is Broadway. And in that triangle in the middle of your screen, you see a little bit of development that was built back after the clearance of urban renewal, and then a large amount of area that never quite got done. Just to the left of center in your screen, you see a big white rectangle. That's the city property, and areas around it are in control of the housing authority or the city variously. Now there's a little building in the middle of your screen, which is sort of wedge shaped, and that's the rear center, right where Spring Street meets Broadway. So that section where Spring Street continues across toward 9W is called Garrigan Drive. So we thought, well, let's take a look at this area and just imagine what if it were filled in, that those gaps in the urban fabric were sewn back together by building and creating green space. And so what you're looking at here is now the missing half of the block on the east side of where development previously occurred, filled in with row houses or live work combinations. And then Garrigan Drive itself, some of the frontage filled in with street-oriented, street-facing buildings. And then that crucial intersection at Spring Street and Broadway, now instead of the rear center feeling like it's kind of hanging out there by itself, is part of an ensemble of buildings that group around the street corner. So we thought it might be worth just imagining these buildings at various scales. So the building right in the center of your screen, we drew it here at a kind of comparable scale to what previously existed and what you recognized from the other side of Broadway. But folks have been talking about what kinds of things could be incorporated to encourage more housing. So we illustrated making that building a little taller. For example, this is how an incentive for adding extra floors or getting extra development potential with adding affordable units as part of the deal could work. So just to toggle those back and forth a little bit, here's kind of the routine scale, 3 or 4 stories, and then here's a couple extra stories for the idea of illustrating affordable housing. I'll just zoom in on that a little bit closer so that you can see the sketch and think about what it would be like if Broadway didn't feel like half a street, but rather a whole street right at this intersection. Now next, Joe and Elise are going to fill us in a little bit about their investigations on Uptown.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I've had such a great time getting to know Kingston, and my life is much better for it. I'm a happier person having been able to come here and get to know the town. Elise and I have been working on Uptown, and it's from our standpoint, it's such a nice place, and there's so many great buildings here. They're positioned nicely on the street, and the scale is charming, and it's really hard to find a place that we can pick on. We did notice this property at the corner here. It looks like it once was a gas station. It is looking like a site that we could see get redeveloped in the not so distant future. So we wanted to take a look specifically at that. We couldn't help but notice that this building is set further back from the street, and its character, the way the windows might have been when it had windows, and the door positioning is nothing like what we see on either side of it in both directions further down the street. Next slide. Here you can see that the buildings that have been here for much longer had doors and windows that face the streets. Their heights range from about 1.5 stories to 2, maybe 2.5. Can't see all the roof lines. The windows are large, doors are facing the street. The buildings are positioned closer to the sidewalk. Next slide. So we were thinking, well, if this site were to redevelop, how would we do it perhaps in a better way than it was done the last time? So we did a little computer simulation. Next slide. and just simply photographed one of the existing buildings and then just did a little computer magic to show what that could look like. So if you notice, the character, the design of the buildings is similar, the height is similar, and the building in this case is positioned closer to the street. And this site in particular has plenty of room in the back of it where a parking lot could go. So you could actually do a 2-story building here and have it meet the current parking code. Next slide. So just looking in plan, if you look at that particular lot at the intersection of Clinton and Westbrook, that the building is kind of a blue-gray building. Those are the existing buildings. It's right now pushed further back towards the back of the site with probably it had gas pumps in the front, but now it looks like a big asphalt parking lot. So if it were to be redeveloped there in kind of a orangey color, we can see the building would be moved closer to the sidewalk, lining up with the buildings on either side of it. And like I said, there's room in the back that where the parking could be for it. Next slide. We also took a look at this property, the Schwenk Business Park, because the buildings certainly and their position look absolutely nothing like Uptown. And so we did kind of a what if, thinking, well, what if a different code was in place at the time these were built, and what might those rules have been, and how might this turn out to be something more in line with the character of Kingston? So just I have a little cartoon. Next slide. That shows the arrangement of those buildings. You can see they're somewhat scattered and mostly parking mixed in there. This is also adjacent to the city parking lot. And so we thought, well, maybe there's an interesting way to get a pedestrian path through there as well. It sits behind the buildings that are on Front Street, and there is the embankment where you can see the topography lines here getting closer together. There's an embankment there that could certainly be turned into something more attractive, perhaps maybe even a park, or at least cleaning out some of the brush. It would be an interesting, it would be an improvement to this part of town. Next slide. In this diagram, you can see that the buildings are how the buildings are arranged on the property. You can see above the embankment, the city parking lot. There's about a 24-foot change in grade between from the top of the embankment to the bottom. Next slide. So in plan, again, you can see the buildings kind of positioned here, and then as an alternative, you can see the same buildings. We just picked them up and moved them around in a different configuration, and then organized the parking lot a little bit more coherently with space for trees. Right now, there's no trees in the parking lot. And then where what looks like a street with a sidewalk on either side running diagonally from upper right to lower left is actually following an alignment that once was a street that had been closed at some point. But we're showing basically that could have a sidewalk. The smaller buildings could be fronting that, so it would be nice to walk from Swank down the street to those buildings, and then showing the possibility, what if that sidewalk were to continue on a trail that could then lead you also up to the city's parking lot. And so this would be a nice pedestrian connection from Swank over to Front Street in the mid-block location, since this block is pretty long. And then we also, in looking at the code, like has been mentioned by the others who spoke before me, that there's a lot of buildings that, in terms of the zoning, are not conforming. What that means is that if that building were to somehow not be there anymore, you would not be able to build it back according to the current zoning code. So we realized this makes no sense. And so if we go to the next slide, that all of these buildings are non-conforming. So what we will do when we get to the point where we're figuring out certain rules is to make sure that we're not causing that to happen again. We don't want to make a building not possible to be rebuilt in its prior form. And next, Rick Hall will speak about street design.
Many of the people we talked to this week talked about walkability and the fact that they like it and they really would like to see more of it. Let's get into some of the details of walkability. What is it and how do we keep what we have? And then how do we get even more? Very important to understand this. Walkability, it's a thing that is safe, attractive, good for business. And the components of walkability include not only walkers, but cyclists and transit users. And those three modes are called the forgotten modes because in a large number of years out of the 20th century, we didn't really include them in our transportation planning and engineering. So they are forgotten and they're no longer forgotten. They're very much on the table now. They are the vulnerable modes. If you're out walking or cycling and it starts raining, then you're subject to the rain and the hot sun and so on. So you're not as protected as others. But it is a healthy thing to do. You use your body to get from A to B. And it's more efficient because you don't have an automobile to find a place to park once you get to your destination. You just walk into the door and you're there. So it is a healthy, efficient mode. But we also include motorists in the walkability mix because they're going to be traveling. They're the most powerful mode. They're protected in the shell of the automobile or truck, and they're actually less efficient from an environmental standpoint. We're using carbon, and we're causing the storage of those vehicles to take up a whole lot of space in the city. So the best thing is to seek a balance between the motorists and the walkers and the cyclists and transit users. That's the best way to go. Now, speed is really, really important to walkability, motor vehicle speed. And the reason for that is very simple high school physics. If you are hit as a pedestrian and the car is going 20 miles per hour, then there's only about a 5% chance that it'll be fatal. And when it jumps up to 30 miles an hour, then 1/2 of the people that get hit by a vehicle going 30 do not survive the crash. And at 40 miles per hour, it's over 80, where the fatal outcome of the crash. So that's why speed is so critical to walkability. And over the years, I have observed these good urban designers working on walkable neighborhoods and walkable scenarios. And so I've identified 10 walkability factors that are very important to achieving walkability in your town. Street trees are very important. They give you shade as you walk. They control your speed actually as they're going by the side of your peripheral vision. Low traffic volumes are better than high traffic volumes, but that's another important walkability factor. Sidewalks are important, but they're not really even in the top 5. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. Narrow streets are important because of the speed. Motor vehicles, drivers will travel more slowly in a narrow lane than they will in a wide lane. Interconnected street network. If you're walking and biking, then you You can seek a different path every day for a familiar A to B trip and make side trips. So interconnected street networks are important. On-street parking is very helpful, not only because it calms the drivers in the main lanes, but it allows people that don't live in this walkable community to drive in and park and bring 2 friends, and then you pretty soon have 6 and 9 different trips that are moving around in the walkable area. The lower traffic speeds are important for the reasons we talked about before. Mixed land use, if you have uniform land use, like 2 square miles of housing or 2 square miles of office, then there's not much need to walk to a different place because it's going to be the same kind of place you just left. Buildings fronting the street. You're comfortable if the buildings are closer to the street because you feel the enclosure, the comfortableness of being in that enclosure. And you don't have to go 2-3 bays of parking to get into that air-conditioned door. So buildings fronting the street, very important. The most important one is small block size. And it's a little anticlimactic, but small block size forces the buildings to face the street, gives you a better mix of land use, and provides lower motor vehicle speeds because the intersections occur more frequently. So that's a good summary of what's important about walkability. Now, there is an important publication that all of my engineer buddies and are using nationwide, and it's called the Green Book, the AASHTO Green Book, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO. And the AASHTO Green Book was updated in 2018 to include more about walkability, more about walking, biking, and transit. And so it's much improved. And it's a major shift that we've been pushing for quite a long time. And the way AASHTO has turned toward walkability in their 2018 edition, just a couple of years ago, they said the design controls and criteria are transportation of people rather than focusing on motor vehicles. Very important. Lower speed, walkable, urban zones, all the things I've been mentioning to you are now in the AASHTO Green Book for the first time. Now, some of the details in the AASHTO Green Book, and this is a fairly geeky material, but look on the upper left, it says, it instructs the engineers and planners to define the context and the roadway type for the project on which you're working. And then it says identify the users. So you are encouraged to determine whether you have pedestrians and bikes and as well as the normal automobile analysis that is done. Identify potential user ranges. And the most important thing on the bottom right is you develop the purpose and need, and you start doing your cross-section alternatives after you've considered context and users and these other new features. So great emphasis on the part of the new Green Book. Now they've gotten a lot of it right. There are 5 different context areas that AASHTO has adopted into the book. And the rural one is pretty obvious. Everybody can visualize that. And the core on the lower right is the number 5, and that's pretty straightforward. The suburban and urban context images that they've selected to put into the Green Book could have a lot of room for improvement. You know you're in the suburban context, I guess, because there's a McDonald's symbol in the middle of it, and it seems to be faster. So we need to give them some more good urban context, like Kingston, and suggest those to AASHTO to better define what we're really talking about. And these this is a sketch that they are using in the manual. The rural number 1. Rural town is something they can identify with pretty well because they've blown a lot of highways right through the middle of small rural towns. So they want to address that explicitly now. And then suburban is clearly the suburban sprawl, and urban is the higher intensity and density. Urban core is the very tall buildings. Okay, for context-based street design, it's very important for projects such as ours with you to start with context classification. Once you know the place type and the character of where you are, then you can blend that with the functional classification of arterial, collector, and local facility types and how they function. So the context comes first, the functioning comes second, and then design examples are ready to go with those two factors when they become well known. So we've begun to look carefully at some of the important context type elements, and intersection density is one of the measures that we use to determine how walkable a place can be. And we have a range here of up to 30 and all the way down to 200 intersections per square mile. Now, you don't have to have a full square mile. If you have a half a square mile, then obviously the numbers are cut in half. So you can see where the most dense intersections are. And this was developed using Max Zabella's program, where he looks in a great deal of detail and character of the community. When we look at block perimeter, that's another measure of how small your block sizes are. And as you can notice, a lot of the walkable areas that you experience now have high block, have low block perimeters. They also have block length on the edge of a block. It's also a shorter number. If you have over 500 or 600 feet on the edge of a block, and it begins to go up to 1,000 and 1,200, then your walkability drops off dramatically because the pedestrian feels a little considerably less important on those large block sizes, and so that's an important walkability factor.
So Rick, that's as simple as if you're going to see your friend and they are on the other end of your block diagonally opposite, or a couple blocks away. When you have a small block network, small block length, small block perimeter, you can easily turn the corner and walk toward them. You can make a much more direct route. But when the blocks are huge, you gotta walk way around to get to that person.
Exactly.
Right? So that's why the big block sizes are fine for motoring, but not so great for walking.
That's right. It's not comfortable. It's not efficient. It's just not walkable. Mix of land use, like I said earlier, is as a very important factor for walkability, because you're able to go from your home to a school, to a grocer, and then back home, and accomplish a lot of those trip chaining activities that we all do. And if you can walk on a small grid to a number of different uses, you've got a walkable community. Now, this is an odd one, floor area ratio. It's how much coverage the building has with respect to the lot size. But still, you can see that Broadway and that diagonal across town has some higher FARs, and that puts you in a more walkable category the higher it is. And this is a kind of a composite of a lot of those factors. And you can see it's beginning to show where the C4, the general walkable neighborhood, is. And then C5, which is the center, the urban center, town center. And that works out pretty well. We've got and you've got C1, which is rural out on the outer edges. And we've got some refinement to do in the calculations, but we're getting a very good picture already about what the context classification and the functional classification is doing. Now, this is a rough analysis based on the content in the code, in your current code, plus the street network that exists out there on the ground. So we'll be refining this, but we made a lot of progress in identifying context based on the parameters that are in the zoning code and on the ground.
So Rick, out there in the Zoom audience, some people around now are wondering, wait a minute, wasn't this going to be a meeting to talk about replacing the zoning code? And here's all this transportation stuff. So what I want to explain is that what we're doing is moving the conversation about land use and urban form into the same room with the conversation about transportation planning and street design. Think of it as a marriage between land use and transportation after a very long, protracted engagement.
Exactly. And your deliberations on the vision for the town, and then that's translated into the form-based code. And at the end of that form-based code, you will have context identified. And then if you have a certain context, then you will design your streets a certain way. And it's really a control factor, an encouragement factor for developers and engineers doing streets. And here are the street classifications. The orange ones are the arterial, the major streets, and the collector streets are the intermediate, and all the rest of them are local streets. So arterial, collector, and local are still important. We're redefining them a bit to make sure that the walkability factors are important in there, but it's the combination of the context classification and the functional classification. And when you put those two together, then you have a nice matrix that you can use to be very specific about the street designs. For example, if you have C5, which is your town center, and you have a collector street, you're in the next to the last column, and you can look over and your posted speed should be 25. Your lanes should be just 2 for the street, and preferably 10-foot lanes. And so there are a lot of parameters that are very specific that the engineers can use and will be guided by when they start designing the streets. Now, we are moving in the direction of 10-foot lanes in most of our walkable communities, whereas at one time, 12-foot wide lanes were standard for arterials and collectors. But those are the widths that you have on the interstate highway system, where you really want to go fast. So the 10-foot lanes help us with speed management, so the walkability is safer for the pedestrians and the bicyclists. So what are the next steps in this marriage of transportation and land use planning, or the zoning for parcels in your town, and the matching that up with good transportation recommendations? First, you really have to get the context maps refined and established. And for both the present and the future, if you have a future transportation plan or a future development plan that's going to change the context or the functional class, then you need to have a separate present and future arrangement. And then you adopt those maps with the 5 context classes. You get the street designs approved for each of those context classes, and then you're well on your way to getting greater walkability for new places. Keep the walkability for the existing places that you know and love, and everybody is singing out of the same hymn book, so to speak, and doing the walkable town sections where you want them.
Rick, I'm going to put you on the spot in a second and ask you to repeat something you said the other day about street closures. First, I think for the audience, it might be helpful for me to see if I could just summarize what I think I learned from what you just said. The old rule books, Ash Toe Green Book and so on, were sort of set up so that when community members went to the transportation experts or officials or agencies wanting certain things, they might hear no. Like if they wanted street trees or narrow and slow, safe streets or small intersections that were easy to cross on foot, bike-friendly details, and so on. Because of the old one-size-fits-all approach that used to be taken by transportation engineering, with one size only fits all, they had to say no. Like if that one size is, interstate highway type or freeway type street designs, and then those dimensions are used on your traditional walkable neighborhood streets, that's the problem with one size fits all. Well, they used to have to say no and say, the book made me do it, and I had to do it that way because that's what's in the standard. The point of this is, if I heard you correctly, the standards have changed, and now we can get to the answer yes for things like street trees and slow, safe street designs. Did I hear you right?
That's exactly right. We've always had context based planning, but for many, many years it was just rural or suburban, and that was it. And there was no clear focus on walkable general neighborhoods or walkable town centers. But now we have 5 different context classes, so it diversifies the kind of context area that can be considered and then logically designed with approved design elements in the transportation network.
You made a great point earlier about the fine-grained street network that characterizes these walkable neighborhoods. And of course, we find that in the very map you showed of historic neighborhoods in Kingston. And you made a comment the other day to the effect of don't close streets. That the in general city policy should be streets are hugely valuable things, assets. They should keep them and not close them. From the traffic engineering point of view, not urban design or economic development, just from the traffic and transportation point of view, why should we resist or avoid closing streets?
Okay, when urban renewal came along, a lot of homes were taken down, a lot of commercial buildings were taken down, and generally that meant the streets between them were eradicated. And so when those areas did get redeveloped, and to some degree, they were always with larger super blocks. And you've heard me mention in the 10 factors for walkability, how many that the most important factor overall is small block size. So the street closings go in the opposite direction of small block size. When you close a street between 2 blocks, then the block size doubles because you've removed the street.
Well, all right. Well, thank you very much, Rick. I think we're going to switch gears now and take a look at the Gridix platform, which was created by Max Zavala, the creator of that and the entrepreneur behind that company. Gridix, Max Zavala, is with us, and he is going to show us how the program works. He's already got it working an internal kind of beta testing sort of way for the existing zoning. And as we build a new draft of the future form-based code, he'll set that up in parallel to it, and we'll be able to compare the two. So Max, tell us about Gridix.
Thank you, Victor, for that. And good evening, everyone. And thank you again for coming here and actually giving us the time also for the ones that join. And so, as I mentioned before, my name is Max Zavala. I'm the co-founder and an owner right now of Gridix. Gridix is a technology company based in South Florida, and we offer services that shows maps and also has access to the property record information in addition to the text. And we've activated the system for the city of Kingston as part of this project. So we can also first analyze the current zoning and then also eventually visualize the proposed zoning. So just gonna walk you through it, more or less what the services are provided. So first of all, this is what you're seeing here is the version of the map. It has currently all of the zoning districts and some other overlays that are important in there. As you can see there, it has all the different zoning in there, and you can of course switch to an aerial view if needed. As I mentioned before, you can also, we did import all of the different property records information. This allows us to, one, show you things such as parcel ID, address, owner, but we also have a zoning engine behind it where we incorporated all the zoning information, and that essentially being setbacks, height, lot coverage, uses. And we've calculated all of those, and this is actually an example. So as you see, you can select a property. It's going to give you information about the zoning, links to the text, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and some other information that is very useful. In addition to that, the system has a very powerful filtering system. So if you're looking for a particular type of parcel, let's say in this example, parcels between 10,000 and half an acre that happen to be on a corner and actually fronting Broadway Street. This is actually very possible to do in the system. As we mentioned before, also, we did digitize all of the text of the zoning regulations and actually most of the city ordinances into the system. This makes it searchable, so you can actually search for a particular term or actually zoning district, for example, and you will be able to find it. It also, the system, once it becomes active, you can actually add bookmarks to it. So this also becomes very useful, especially as we start showing the before and the after. You can actually make essentially bookmarks that will take you to certain places if you want to remember a particular location. Another key element of our platform is that it's all web-based, and that allows us also to be mobile ready, meaning that the map, the text, and all those regulations that I showed you before, they're accessible in your phone, and that makes it also very useful. Now, I mentioned very briefly during that we do have a zoning engine behind our system. So this is a patented system that, as I said, it has the capability of storing all the zoning regulations and then lets you create projects or selecting parcels. And it will actually calculate for you, as you see there, amassing, and then all the numbers that comes with it. So density, maximum buildable area, etc. The team is actually going to be using this system as well to testing some of those different scenarios. So we can start testing out what happens if we change the setbacks, what happens if we modify the step back as we go vertical, low coverage. Basically, we can test all the different elements that has to do with the physical envelope of those buildings, and then test it out throughout the city. This actually has been shown in a couple of different presentations before, but actually, as you saw, that there was certain maps that show some of the nonconformities. It was actually generated by our system, since after we incorporated all the existing regulations, we calculated every single parcel in the city, and we identified something like this, where according to zoning, it requires 20-foot side setbacks, but the parcel itself is a little bit under 40 feet wide, which essentially makes it unbuildable. So again, though, this was achieved with our system. So I'm actually going to show you the application in real life, just so you see that it's not just a slide and static images. So this is the map version of the system. It's a fully interactive 3D model mapping platform of the whole city, where you can get closer to the streets, and as I showed before, you can actually switch to the aerial image if needed. And let's get in there in a second. And of course, you can also select parcels. So once you select the parcel, as I show you in there in the screenshot, it was going to give you certain information about the zoning, uses that are permitted, and some of the basic information that comes back out. Very briefly also, let me show you again the layers. You can turn on layers such as the zoning, or you can even do just a smaller combinations. So this is actually the map portion of the system. As you can see up here, it has map and text. So when you switch to the text, let's just have another tab for that. This is the full text digitized for the whole city. So as I said, you can actually navigate it through. You can create as all the different sections are actually, of course, here on the left. If I go here to one of the top elements, you're gonna see you can share links, you can print it, you can download it even to PDF or Word, and then of course this is the icon to creating the bookmarks. So I'm sure, as you can imagine, I'm being the owner and creator of this application. I probably can talk about this system for days, but we've definitely overloaded all of you with information. It's been a wonderful presentation. So I'm going to stop right there and see maybe there's some particular questions and go from there.
Thank you, Max. That was great. And we're really excited to have the ability to use this software, especially as we're getting started. We're going to be getting started with some new draft code provisions, so we can be able to easily compare the existing and the potential future zoning and kind of compare the differences. So that'll be real interesting. So just a few last notes on next steps. So I want to remind everybody the website, engagekingston.com/Kingston forward. You can go there and we'll have surveys and the ability for you to ask us questions on anything that you've seen here tonight. Also, I wanted to mention we'll have an executive summary of the charrette and all the feedback we've been hearing coming in the next few weeks. And so over the next few months, we're going to be asking for you all to continue to give input on these visioning sketches and the initial ideas through the end of the year and into early 2022. We do anticipate that the environmental assessment, the draft GEIS process will be getting started early next year with a scoping session anticipated for February, where we're going to determine what things need to be analyzed. And then a draft code a little later in the spring. So we'll be working to create that and anticipate we'll be coming back to review with you all. So with that, just want to thank everyone for your time tonight. Remember, please go to the website for questions and feedback, and we look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you.